When bullets started flying in the dusty streets of Texas, 1873, the richest rancher in 3 counties was bleeding to death, and the only person willing to save him was the one woman society said he could never love. What happened next changed everything, but their love story almost cost them both their lives. Stay with me. This is a story of courage, forbidden love, and a promise that defied an entire town. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Willow Creek, Texas. As Jake Morrison rode hard toward town, blood seeping through his torn shirt, the year was 1873, and Jake was no ordinary cowboy. At 35, he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, the Morrison spread that stretched as far as the eye could see. His wealth came from years of shrewd cattle deals and land acquisitions, making him one of the richest men in East Texas. But money couldn't stop a bullet. Help! Somebody help me! Jake's voice cracked as he slumped forward on his horse, the animal sensing its master's distress and slowing to a nervous trot. The ambush had come from nowhere. 3 masked riders demanding his money. When Jake reached for his gun instead of his wallet, leads started flying. The town doctor, old Pete Henderson, was drunk again, as usual by afternoon. Folks scrambled around the dusty main street, unsure what to do with the bleeding ranch owner. That's when Martha Jenkins, the blacksmith's wife, spoke up with authority that surprised everyone. Get him to Sarah Washington's place. Quick! She's the only one with steady hands and real healing knowledge around here. Some of the men hesitated. Sarah was colored, and though slavery had ended 8 years ago, old prejudices died hard in small Texas towns. But Jake was dying, and everyone knew it. They carried him to the small wooden cabin on the edge of town where Sarah Washington had set up her practice as a healer and midwife. At 25, she possessed knowledge that surpassed most trained doctors, having learned from her grandmother, who'd been a plantation healer back in Louisiana. Her hands were gentle, but sure. Her voice calm even in crisis. Sarah took one look at Jake's pale face and the spreading crimson stain on his shirt and immediately sprang into action. Put him on the table. Martha, I need clean water boiling. Tom, ride to the general store and get me all the clean cotton fabric they have. As she cut away Jake's bloodied shirt, Sarah's trained eyes assessed the damage. The bullet had entered just below his left shoulder, missing the heart by inches, but nicking something important. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak but steady. You're going to live, Mr. Morrison, she whispered, though she wasn't entirely certain. But you've got a long fight ahead of you. Jake's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, focusing on the most beautiful face he'd ever seen. Dark skin smooth as silk, eyes that held both strength and compassion, and hands that seemed to glow with healing power as they worked on his wounded body. Then darkness claimed him, but not before one thought echoed in his fading consciousness. An angel was saving his life. For 3 days, Jake Morrison hovered between life and death in Sarah Washington's small cabin. The bullet had been more troublesome than she'd initially thought. It had fragments that kept working their way toward vital organs. Sarah barely slept, checking on him every few hours, changing bandages, forcing medicine down his throat when fever made him delirious. On the 4th morning, Jake's eyes opened clearly for the first time. The cabin was simple, but spotlessly clean, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the smell of healing salves in the air. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, and he could hear Sarah humming softly as she prepared something in a small stove. Water, he croaked. Sarah turned immediately, a smile lighting up her face. You're back with us. Thank the Lord. She brought him a cup of cool water, supporting his head as he drank. Her touch was gentle, but professional, though Jake felt something electric pass between them. How long? He asked. For days. You've been fighting hard, Mr. Morrison. The fever broke just last night. Sarah sat in the wooden chair beside his makeshift bed. The bullet's out, but you're still weak. Lost a lot of blood. Jake studied her face in the morning light. She was even more beautiful than he'd remembered in his fevered state. But more than that, there was an intelligence in her eyes, a competence that impressed him. This woman had saved his life when the town doctor couldn't even stand up straight. Why? He asked simply. Sarah tilted her head. Why what? Why save me? Half the folks in town probably told you to let the rich white man die. A shadow crossed Sarah's face. I took an oath to help anyone who needs healing, regardless of who they are or what they've done. Besides, she added with a small smile, you never gave me any trouble about my color when you needed help. Over the following days, as Jake slowly regained his strength, He found himself looking forward to Sarah's visits. She would check his bandages, bring him meals, and sometimes sit and talk. He learned that she'd been educated by missionaries in Louisiana before coming to Texas. Her medical knowledge came from her grandmother, but she could read and write better than most men in town. "I have a dream," Sarah told him one evening as she changed his bandages. "I want to build a real medical clinic here in Willow Creek, somewhere clean and proper, with real medical supplies and equipment, somewhere that could help everyone, regardless of their circumstances." Jake found himself hanging on her every word. "That's a fine dream, Miss Sarah. This town could use proper medical care." Sarah laughed softly. "Dreams don't pay for medical equipment, Mr. Morrison, but a girl can hope." As she leaned over to check his wound, Jake caught the scent of lavender in her hair. Something stirred in his chest. That had nothing to do with his injury and everything to do with the remarkable womanhood. Saved his life. But there was something Sarah wasn't telling him, something about why an educated, skilled woman like her had ended up in a dusty Texas town, living in a small cabin and fighting for respect every day. By the end of his second week in Sarah's care, Jake Morrison was sitting up and taking short walks around the cabin. His strength was returning, but he found himself reluctant to leave. The cabin had become a sanctuary, and Sarah had become something he couldn't quite name. "You're healing faster than I expected," Sarah said, unwrapping his bandages to examine the wound. Her fingers were gentle, but professional as she cleaned the area. "The infection is completely gone, and the tissue is knitting well." Jake watched her work, noting the concentration on her face, the sure movements of her hands. "You saved my life, Sarah. I don't know how to repay that kind of debt." Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes. "There's no debt, Mr. Morrison. I did what anyone with healing knowledge should do. Call me Jake. And what you did, it was more than duty. You cared for me like—" He paused, searching for words. "Like I mattered to you." A blush crept up Sarah's neck. "Every patient matters to me, but not like this." Jake reached out, gently touching her hand. "Sarah, I need you to know something. These past 2 weeks, getting to know you, seeing your kindness, your skill, your strength. I've never met a woman like you." Sarah pulled her hand away, but not before Jake felt her fingers tremble. "Mr. Morrison, Jake, you're still recovering. Sometimes patients feel grateful, even attached to their caregivers. It's natural, but it passes. This isn't gratitude, Sarah. This is something deeper." Jake's voice was quiet, but intense. "I'm a man who's built everything I have through careful decisions and hard work. I don't speak lightly when I say that meeting you has changed something fundamental in me." Sarah stood abruptly, turning toward the window. "You don't understand what you're saying. The complications, the problems it would cause. I understand perfectly." Jake struggled to his feet, his wound protesting, but his determination stronger. "I understand that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. I understand that you're brilliant, compassionate, and stronger than half the men in this county. And I understand that I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's shoulders tensed, and when she turned around, there were tears in her eyes. "Jake, you're a wealthy white rancher. I'm a colored woman trying to build a life in a town that barely tolerates me. Do you have any idea what would happen if people knew you were talking like this?" "I know exactly what would happen, and I'm telling you that I don't care." Jake moved closer, ignoring the pull of his healing wound. "Sarah, I want to help you build that clinic. I want to make sure you have everything you need to help people. But more than that, I want to be part of your life." Sarah shook her head. "You're talking about things that can't happen, Jake. Not in this world. Not in this time. Then we'll change the world." Jake's voice was firm with conviction. "Sarah, I have money, influence, land. I can protect you, support your dreams, make sure—" "Stop." Sarah held up her hand. "Just stop. You're making promises you can't keep, talking about a future that can't exist." But even as she spoke, Jake could see the longing in her eyes. She felt it too, this connection that had grown between them during his recovery. The question was whether love could overcome the barriers that society had built between them. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and Jake realized that the storm approaching wasn't just in the sky. The storm that had been threatening finally broke that night, rain lashing against the cabin windows with fierce intensity. Jake lay on his makeshift bed, listening to Sarah moving quietly around the main room, the soft sounds of her evening routine. His wound was healing well, but his heart was in turmoil. Lightning illuminated the cabin, and in that brief flash, Jake saw Sarah silhouetted against the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She was awake too, wrestling with the same thoughts that kept him staring at the ceiling. "Sarah?" he called softly. "Yes, can't sleep either." A pause. "The storm's loud." Jake smiled despite everything. They both knew it wasn't the storm keeping them awake. "Sarah, come sit with me, please. We need to talk about this." After a long moment, Sarah approached his bed, carrying a small oil lamp. In its gentle glow, she looked ethereal, beautiful in a way that made Jake's chest tighten. She sat in the chair beside him, but kept her eyes downcast. "Jake, what you said earlier about changing the world, that's not how the world works. Maybe not for most people, but I'm not most people. Sarah, I have resources, influence." The Morrison name carries weight in 3 counties. Jake pushed himself up to sitting, wincing slightly. "I meant what I said about helping you build that clinic." Sarah looked up sharply. "I won't be any man's charity case. It wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment in something I believe in someone I believe in." Jake's voice was earnest. "Sarah, you've seen more of life and death than most doctors. You have knowledge that could save hundreds of lives. Why shouldn't you have the resources to do that work properly?" "Because people like me don't get resources like that. Because when a white man gives a colored woman that kind of help, people assume," she trailed off. "Assume what? That he cares about her, that he recognizes her worth." Jake leaned forward. "Sarah, I'm 35 years old. I've never been married because I never found a woman who challenged me, who made me want to be better than I am. You do that." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes. "You don't know what you're asking. The scandal, the danger. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to let me love you. I'm asking you to consider a future where we face whatever comes together." Jake reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "Sarah, I'm not naive about the challenges, but I am certain about my feelings." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I've dreamed of having my own clinic since I was a girl. Real medical equipment, a clean space, the ability to help anyone who needs it without worrying about whether they can pay. Then let's make it happen. Together, and if the town turns against us, if they try to hurt you because of me," Jake's grip on her hand tightened, "then we'll face that too. Sarah, I built everything I have by taking calculated risks, but this isn't a risk. This is the most certain thing I've ever felt." Lightning flashed again, and in that moment, Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm scared, Jake. So am I. But I'm more scared of losing you than I am of what people might say or do." Sarah was quiet for a long time, the storm raging outside while emotion stormed inside the small cabin. Finally, she spoke. "If we do this, if we even try, it has to be on equal terms. I won't be your kept woman or your secret. If you're serious about this, then you're serious about all of it." Jake felt his heart soar. "Equal partners in everything. Your dreams, my resources. Our future, our future." Sarah repeated softly, as if testing how the words sounded. But even as they sat there, hands clasped in the lamplight, neither could shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. 3 weeks after the shooting, Jake was strong enough to return to his ranch, but he found himself reluctant to leave Sarah's cabin. They had spent hours talking about her dreams for the clinic, and Jake had begun making mental plans for how to make it happen. But first, there was the matter of the town's reaction to his extended stay with the colored healer. "People are talking," Sarah said quietly as she prepared his final bandage change. "Martha Jenkins mentioned that some folks think it's odd, you staying here so long when you could afford to send for a real doctor from Austin." Jake bristled. "You are a real doctor, Sarah. Better than any man with a fancy diploma who learned medicine from books instead of actually saving lives." Sarah smiled at his fierce defense of her, but her expression remained troubled. "That's not how they see it. You know it. Your reputation, my reputation, is my concern." Jake caught her hands, stilling their nervous movement. "Sarah, I've made my decision. I'm going to help you build that clinic, and I'm going to court you properly while I do it." "Court me?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Jake, you can't be serious about making this public." "I'm completely serious. I'll start by talking to Reverend Matthews about adding a proper medical wing to the church. Then I'll approach the town council about supporting a real medical facility." Jake's voice grew stronger with each word. "And I'll make it clear that Miss Sarah Washington will be running it." Sarah shook her head. "They'll never accept it. A colored woman running a clinic with white patients? They will if the alternative is watching their families die because old Pete's too drunk to set a broken bone." Jake stood, testing his strength. The wound pulled slightly, but held. "Sarah, You saved the life of the richest man in the county. That carries weight, whether people want to admit it or not. Over the next hour, Jake outlined his plan. He would return to his ranch and begin the process of selling some of his cattle. To raise funds for medical equipment, he would approach the town's leaders about establishing a proper medical facility, and he would make it clear that Sarah Washington was not just his healer, but someone he held in the highest regard. "What about us?" Sarah asked as Jake prepared to leave. Whatever this is between us." Jake turned from saddling his horse, his eyes serious. "That depends on you, Sarah. I've told you how I feel. I've told you what I want. The question is whether you're brave enough to want it to." Sarah's internal struggle was visible on her face. Finally, she spoke. "I care about you, Jake, more than I should, more than is safe. But caring and acting on that caring are two different things. Then let me prove to you that it's safe to act on it." Jake approached her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Give me a month, Sarah. 1 month to show this town that you deserve their respect and support. If I can't make progress in that time, then what? Then I'll accept whatever decision you make about us." Jake's voice was quiet, but firm. "But I won't give up on you, Sarah, or on us." As Jake rode away from the cabin, Sarah stood in the doorway watching him go. Her heart told her to trust him, to believe in the future he painted with such conviction. But her mind reminded her of the harsh realities they faced. That evening, Sarah received her first indication of the challenges ahead. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, arrived at her door with a stern expression and unwelcome news. "Miss Washington, I feel it's my Christian duty to warn you. There's talk in town about your relationship with Mr. Morrison. Some people are saying you've overstepped yourself. Gotten ideas above your station." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was cold. "It would be wise for you to remember your place." After the woman left, Sarah sat alone in her cabin, wondering if Jake Morrison's love would be strong enough to overcome a lifetime of prejudice and fear. The answer would come sooner than she expected. Jake Morrison's return to his ranch was met with suspicious looks from his own men. Word had spread quickly through the county that the boss had spent 3 weeks being nursed by the colored healer. Instead of sending for a proper white doctor from the city, boss, his foreman, Tom Bradley, approached cautiously as Jake inspected the cattle in the north pasture. "The men are wondering about your plans. Some of the other ranchers have been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Jake's voice was deceptively calm. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "About whether you're thinking clear. Spending so much time with that Washington woman, they're saying maybe the bullet addled your brain some." Jake turned to face his foreman, his eyes hard as flint. "Tom, you've worked for me for 8 years. In that time, have I ever made a decision that hurt this ranch or the men who work it?" "No, sir, you haven't." "Then trust me now. Miss Washington saved my life when everyone else was ready to let me die. She's a skilled healer, and this county needs what she can offer." Jake's voice carried the authority that had built his empire. "Anyone who has a problem with that can find work elsewhere." Tom nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. No problem here, boss." But Jake knew the real test would come in town. That afternoon, he rode into Willow Creek with a specific purpose. His first stop was the bank, where he requested a meeting with the town council. His second stop was the general store, where he ordered medical supplies to be shipped from Austin. His third stop was the church. Reverend Matthews was a cautious man who learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of a small Texas town. When Jake Morrison walked into his office with a proposal, the Reverend listened carefully. "You want to build a medical clinic attached to the church?" Reverend Matthews repeated Jake's words slowly. "That's right. A proper facility with real medical equipment, clean conditions, and a skilled practitioner to run it." Jake leaned forward in his chair. "Reverend, how many people in this congregation have suffered or died because we don't have adequate medical care?" The Reverend considered this. "More than I care to count. Old Pete Henderson is, well, he's not reliable. Miss Washington is reliable. She's skilled, educated, and dedicated to healing. She saved my life, and she could save others." Jake's voice was persuasive but respectful. "All she needs is proper support and equipment. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate what Miss Washington did for you, but you must understand the delicate nature of what you're proposing. A colored woman treating white patients in a facility funded by the church. Reverend, didn't Jesus heal everyone who came to him, regardless of their station or color?" Jake's question was gentle but pointed. "Isn't providing healing To those who needed exactly what the church should be doing, the conversation continued for over an hour. Jake presented his case methodically, addressing each concern with logic and scripture. By the end, Reverend Matthews had agreed to present the proposal to the church board. Jake's final stop of the day was Sarah's cabin. He found her treating a young Mexican boy who'd been kicked by a horse. She worked with quiet efficiency, setting the broken arm and speaking softly to calm the frightened child. There, she said, finishing the splint, keep it still for 6 weeks, and it'll heal strong. Have your mama change the bandages every few days. After the boy and his mother left, Sarah turned to Jake. How did it go in town? Better than expected, but not as well as I'd hoped. Jake sat in the familiar chair beside her table. The Reverend's willing to consider the clinic proposal. The banks agreed to extend credit for medical supplies, but there's resistance. Sarah wasn't surprised. What kind of resistance? The kind we expected. People questioning whether a colored woman should be treating white patients. People suggesting that my judgment has been compromised by my feelings for you. Sarah's heart skipped at his casual reference to his feelings, but her expression remained serious. Maybe they're right to question it. Jake, maybe you are thinking with your heart instead of your head. Jake stood and moved to where she was cleaning her medical instruments. Sarah, I've built a cattle empire by thinking with my head. Every decision I've made for the past 15 years has been calculated and practical. He paused. But this decision, supporting you, believing in us, this is the first time my head and my heart have agreed completely. Sarah looked up at him, searching his face. What happens now? Now we find out if love really can change the world. Jake's smile was confident, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The town council meets next week to discuss the clinic proposal. Whatever they decide will tell us a lot about what we're facing. As Jake prepared to leave, Sarah caught his arm. Jake, whatever happens, thank you for believing in me, for fighting for my dreams. No one's ever done that before. Someone should have. Jake replied softly, and from now on, someone always will. But neither of them knew that outside in the gathering dusk, hostile eyes were watching Jake Morrison leave the colored healer's cabin once again. And those eyes belonged to people who had no intention of letting this relationship continue. The town council meeting was held on a crisp September evening in 1873. In the back room of Henderson's General Store, Jake Morrison sat at the long wooden table, facing 5 men who would determine Sarah Washington's future in Willow Creek. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Mayor William Hartwell, a portly man with suspicious eyes, called the meeting to order. Jake, we've all heard your proposal about this medical facility. Before we discuss it, I think we need to address some concerns that have been raised. What concerns? Jake's voice was level, but Sarah, watching from outside through a crack in the shutters, could see the tension in his shoulders. Banker Charles Pemberton leaned forward. Jake, you're a respected man in this community. Built yourself quite an empire, but folks are wondering if your judgment's been influenced by your association with that colored woman, Miss Washington. Jake corrected firmly. Her name is Miss Sarah Washington, and she's the most skilled medical practitioner within 100 miles of here. She's a darky playing at being a doctor, interrupted Samuel Pierce, who owned the largest farm after Jake's ranch. My wife won't even let her touch our livestock, much less our family. Jake's fist clenched under the table. Miss Washington saved my life. Sam, where was your medical expertise when I was bleeding to death in the street? Reverend Matthews, who had been quiet until now, spoke carefully. Jake, I understand your gratitude, but we must consider the appropriateness of having a colored woman in a position of medical authority over white citizens. Would you rather have old Pete Henderson, who can't tell the difference between whiskey and medical alcohol? Jake's voice rose slightly. How many people have to die because of your prejudices? Mayor Hartwell held up his hand. Now, Jake, there's no need to get heated. We're all reasonable men here, but you have to understand our position on what you're proposing. It goes against the natural order of things. The natural order. Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Gentlemen, let me tell you about the natural order. 3 weeks ago, I was dying. Every one of you would have watched me bleed out rather than compromise your precious sensibilities. Miss Washington didn't see a white man or a rich man. She saw a human being who needed help. She gave it. Outside, Sarah pressed closer to the window, her heart pounding as she listened to Jake defend her with such passion. Furthermore, Jake continued, I'm prepared to fund this clinic entirely with my own money. The only thing I'm asking from this council is official recognition and support." Banker Pemberton shook his head. "Jake, even if we agreed, which I'm not saying we are, how do you think the other communities will react? Austin, Houston, San Antonio? They'll see Willow Creek as a place where coloreds don't know their place. They'll see Willow Creek as a place where people get proper medical care." Jake shot back. "Gentlemen, I'm not asking you to like Miss Washington. I'm asking you to recognize her value to this community." The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and tempers flaring. When it was over, the vote was 3-2 against the clinic proposal. Only Reverend Matthews and the hardware store owner, Jim Crawford, had supported Jake's plan. As Jake emerged from the store, Sarah stepped out of the shadows. His face was grim, and she could see the defeat in his eyes. "They said no," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. For now, Jake's voice was tight with controlled anger. "But this isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. Maybe it should be." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am overstepping myself." Jake spun to face her, his eyes blazing. "Don't you dare let them convince you that you're worth less than you are. Sarah, you have a gift that can save lives. I'll be damned if I let a bunch of small-minded men waste that gift." But even as Jake spoke with conviction, Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his own eyes. The town had spoken, and their message was clear. Love between a white man and a colored woman had no place in Willow Creek, Texas. What neither of them realized was that their real troubles were just beginning. 2 days after the failed council meeting, Sarah Washington received her first direct threat. She found it nailed to her cabin door when she returned from delivering a baby. On the outskirts of town, a crude note written in block letters. "Uppity Negroes who don't know their place get hurt. Stop." Seeing the white man, Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words. She looked around the empty street, but saw no one watching. Still, she felt eyes on her as she quickly went inside and barred the door. That same morning, Jake Morrison was dealing with problems of his own. 3 of his ranch hands had quit overnight, claiming they didn't want to work for a man who was consorting with coloreds. Even worse, 2 of his biggest cattle buyers from Austin had sent word that they were reconsidering their contracts. "Boss," Tom Bradley approached Jake as he stood looking out over his vast holdings. "Maybe you should think about backing away from this business with the healer woman. The men are getting spooked." Jake turned to face his foreman, his expression dangerous. "Tom, are you telling me how to run my personal life?" "No, sir. Just saying that when your personal life starts affecting the ranch, maybe it's time to reconsider your priorities." "My priorities are perfectly clear." Jake's voice was cold. "Anyone who can't accept that can find work elsewhere. That includes you, Tom." Tom Bradley had worked for Jake for 8 years, but he recognized the finality in his boss's voice. He nodded curtly and walked away, knowing he'd have to make a choice soon. That afternoon, Jake rode into town to check on Sarah, but found her cabin empty. Growing concerned, he asked around and learned she was at the Fletcher farm delivering a baby. By the time he reached the farm, it was nearly sunset. He found Sarah in the barn, washing her hands in a bucket of water. She looked exhausted, and there were tear stains on her cheeks. "Sarah, what's wrong? Is the baby all right?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of pain. "The baby's fine, a healthy boy, but Mrs. Fletcher, she paid me and then asked me never to come back, said she was grateful for my help, but that she couldn't be seen associating with me anymore." Jake felt his heart break a little. "Sarah, it's starting. Jake, what you warned me about. People are choosing sides, and I'm losing." Sarah's voice was thick with unshed tears. "Mrs. Fletcher has used my services for 3 births. I thought she respected me." Jake pulled Sarah into his arms, feeling her small frame shake with suppressed sobs. "This isn't your fault. This is fear and ignorance, and it'll pass. Will it?" Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Jake, I found a note on my door this morning. A threat. Someone wants me to stop seeing you." Jake's expression went deadly serious. "What kind of threat?" Sarah showed him the crumpled note. Jake read it twice, his jaw muscles working with controlled fury. "That's it," he said finally. "You're not staying alone anymore. Pack what you need. You're coming to the ranch." "Jake, I can't. If people think I'm living with you, I don't care what people think." Jake's voice was fierce. "Sarah, I won't let anyone hurt you. The ranch has security, men who are loyal to me. You'll be safe there." Sarah shook her head. "Don't you see? That would just prove what they're all saying, that I'm your kept woman, that this whole clinic idea is just you taking care of your mistress. Then what do you suggest?" Jake's frustration was evident. That I let you stay alone while someone threatens you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a decision that would change everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady with resolve. There's one way to end the speculation, to make our relationship legitimate. In the eyes of the law and God, she met Jake's eyes directly. You could marry me. The words hung in the air between them. Jake stared at Sarah, his mind racing. Marriage. It would solve the immediate problem of her safety and their reputations, but it would also create a dozen new problems, challenges that could destroy everything he built. Sarah, he said carefully, are you proposing to me, despite everything? Sarah smiled. I suppose I am, though I never imagined doing it in a barn, covered in hay and birthing blood. Jake laughed, the sound surprising them both in a tense moment. Well, I never imagined being proposed to by the most beautiful, brave, stubborn woman in Texas, but here we are. Is that a yes? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears on her cheeks. Sarah Washington, it would be my honor to be your husband, but are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. The whole world will know where we stand. I'm sure. Sarah whispered, I love you. Jake Morrison, I want to build that clinic with you, face whatever comes with you, grow old with you. As Jake kissed her there in the barn, with the Texas sunset painting the sky orange and red, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line or the rifle in his hands. Word of Jake Morrison's engagement to Sarah Washington spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By morning, half the town was in an uproar, and the other half was in shock. No one could remember a white man of Jake's standing ever marrying a colored woman in East Texas. Not legally, not publicly, and certainly not proudly. Jake had spent the night at Sarah's cabin, sitting in a chair by her bed with his rifle across his knees. They had agreed to marry quickly, within the week if possible, but first they had to find someone willing to perform the ceremony. Reverend Matthews won't do it, Sarah said as she prepared breakfast. Not after the council meeting, then we'll find someone. Who will? Jake's voice was determined, but Sarah could hear the underlying worry. There has to be a preacher somewhere who'll marry us. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Jake moved to the window, rifle ready, but relaxed when he saw it was Tom Bradley and the other ranch hands. His relief turned to concern when he noticed their grim expressions. Tom dismounted and approached the cabin, his hat in his hands. Boss, I need to talk to you. Jake stepped outside, leaving his rifle just inside the door. What is it, Tom? The men took a vote last night. I'm speaking for all of them when I say we can't support what you're doing. Tom's voice was respectful, but firm. We've got nothing against Miss Washington personally, but this marriage, it's going to destroy the ranch and us along with it. Is that a threat, Tom? No, sir. It's a warning. The other ranchers are already talking about boycotting anyone who does business with you. Half your cattle buyers have backed out of their contracts. And there's talk. Tom hesitated. What kind of talk? Ugly talk. About teaching uppity coloreds their place. About making examples of white men who forget where they belong. Tom met Jake's eyes. Boss, I've ridden with you for 8 years. You're a good man. But this path you're on, it's going to get someone killed. Jake felt the weight of Tom's words, but his resolve didn't waver. Tom, I appreciate your concern, but my mind's made up. Anyone who can't live with that decision knows where the door is. After Tom and the others left, Jake found Sarah sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her hands. You heard? He asked. I heard. Sarah's voice was quiet. Jake, maybe we should wait. Give people time to get used to the idea. Time won't change their hearts. Sarah, and waiting will just give our enemies more opportunity to cause trouble. Jake sat across from her. Are you having second thoughts? Sarah looked up at him, and Jake saw the fear in her eyes warring with determination. I'm terrified, but I love you too much to let fear win. That afternoon, they rode together to the next town over, Cedar Falls, about 20 miles east. Jake had heard that the new preacher there, a young man named David Parker, was more progressive in his thinking. It was a risk, but their options were limited. Reverend Parker was indeed young, probably no more than 28, with earnest eyes and calloused hands that spoke of physical labor before he found his calling. He listened to their request with a serious expression. Mr. Morrison, Miss Washington, I understand what you're asking of me, and I want you to understand what it could mean. Reverend Parker's voice was gentle, but honest. Marrying you could cost me my position here. It could cost both of you your lives. We understand the risks, Jake replied, but we believe love is stronger than hatred, and that God doesn't see color when he looks at two hearts joined in love. Reverend Parker was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he spoke. I became a preacher because I believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ, and Christ taught us to love one another, regardless of race or station. He met their eyes. I'll marry you, but it has to be private, and it has to be soon. Word will get out. And when it does, when can you do it? Sarah asked. Tomorrow evening, after sunset. Bring the witnesses, people you trust completely. As they rode back toward Willow Creek, Jake and Sarah were both lost in thought. They were less than 24 hours away from changing their lives forever, from taking a step that would make them outcasts in their community but would bind them together as husband and wife. Jake, Sarah said as they neared her cabin, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you before. Jake felt his stomach drop. What is it? The reason I came to Willow Creek, why I left Louisiana. Sarah's voice was tight with old pain. I was engaged before, to a colored man named Marcus. We were planning to marry, start a family. What happened? He was killed, lynched by a group of white men who claimed he'd been disrespectful to a white woman. He hadn't. He was just walking down the street, but that didn't matter. Sarah's hands were shaking. I left Louisiana because I couldn't bear to stay where he died, but also because I was afraid to love anyone again, afraid to take risks, afraid to hope for more than just survival. Jake reached over and took her hand. Sarah, why are you telling me this now? Because tomorrow, when we marry, I want you to know that I'm choosing hope over fear. I'm choosing to believe that this time, love will win. Sarah's voice was stronger now. But I also want you to know what happened to the last man who loved me. So if you want to change your mind. Jake stopped his horse and pulled Sarah's to a halt beside him. In the fading light, he could see the tears in her eyes, the vulnerability she was showing him. Sarah Washington, he said firmly, tomorrow evening I'm going to marry you, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that our love is stronger than their hatred. Nothing you've told me changes that. But as they rode the final miles to her cabin, both Jake and Sarah knew that their wedding day would likely bring more than just joy. It would bring a reckoning that had been building since the day they first met. The wedding of Jake Morrison and Sarah Washington took place on October 15, 1873, in a small grove of oak trees behind the Cedar Falls Church. The witnesses were Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a traveling physician who had become Sarah's friend, and Jim Crawford from the hardware store, one of the few men in Willow Creek who had supported the clinic proposal. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Jake had picked that morning. Jake wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to important cattle negotiations. But he'd never felt more nervous about any deal in his life. Reverend Parker's ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. Jake and Sarah, you come before God and these witnesses knowing that your union faces challenges that most couples will never encounter, but love that is tested is love that grows stronger. Do you, Jake Morrison, take Sarah Washington as your wife, to love and protect her against all adversity? I do. Jake's voice was strong and clear. Do you, Sarah Washington, take Jake Morrison as your husband, to love and support him through whatever trials may come? I do. Sarah's voice never wavered. When Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Sarah with all the passion and promise he felt in his heart. For that moment, standing in the grove with the October sunset painting the sky golden, they were just a man and woman in love, married in the sight of God. The reality of what they'd done hit them. During the ride back to Willow Creek, they were officially Mr. and Mrs. Morrison now, the first legally married interracial couple in the county's history. There would be no hiding, no pretending, no going back. Where will we live? Sarah asked as they neared town. The ranch, Jake replied without hesitation. You're my wife now, Sarah. My home is your home. But when they arrived at the Morrison Ranch, they found it eerily quiet. The bunkhouse was empty, the corrals unattended. Jake's heart sank as he realized what had happened. His men had abandoned him. Tom Bradley emerged from the main house as they approached, his face grim. Boss, Jake, I stayed to give you this. He handed Jake a folded paper. It's my resignation, and the keys to the house. The other boys left this morning after word came that you'd gone through with it. Jake read the resignation letter, his jaw tight. What about the cattle, the horses? I sent word to your buyers. Most of them have already canceled their contracts. The few who haven't are demanding a 30. Percent reduction in price. Tom's voice was sympathetic, but resigned. Jake, I'm sorry, but this is bigger than any of us can handle. After Tom rode away, Jake and Sarah stood alone in the yard of the ranch that had been Jake's pride and joy. The silence was deafening. No men calling to each other, no horses whinnying, no sounds of a working ranch. Jake, Sarah said quietly, "What have we done?" Before Jake could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses. A group of riders was coming up the main road to the ranch, at least a dozen men, some carrying torches despite the fact that it wasn't fully dark yet. Jake recognized several faces in the group: Mayor Hartwell, Banker Pemberton, Samuel Pierce, and others from town. But there were also strangers, men from other counties who'd come specifically for this confrontation. "Get inside," Jake told Sarah, his hand moving to his gun. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm your wife now. We face this together." The riders stopped about 20 yards from the house. Mayor Hartwell spurred his horse forward to act as spokesman. "Jake Morrison," his voice carried across the yard, "you've disgraced yourself and this community with your actions. We're here to give you one chance to set things right. And how would I do that?" Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah could feel the tension in his body. "Send the woman away. End all this mockery of a marriage. Return to your proper place in society." Hartwell's voice was cold. "Do that, and you can rebuild your life here." Jake stepped forward, his hand still near his gun. "Gentlemen, let me make something very clear. Sarah Morrison is my wife, legally and in the sight of God. Anyone who threatens her threatens me. Anyone who tries to harm her will answer to me. You're outnumbered." Morrison called out Samuel Pierce. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not making it hard at all," Jake replied. "I'm making it simple. This is my land. That's my wife. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave before someone gets hurt." The tension in the air was electric. Sarah could see hands moving toward guns on both sides. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the confrontation would explode into violence. That's when Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and the mounted men. "Gentlemen," her voice was clear and strong, "I understand your concerns. Change is frightening, especially when it challenges everything you've been taught. But I want you to know something about your neighbor, Jake Morrison." Sarah began to speak, and as she did, something remarkable happened. Her words, delivered with dignity and compassion, began to diffuse the volatile situation. She talked about healing, about service to the community, about the Christian values of love and acceptance. But even as some of the men began to look uncomfortable with their mission, Sarah noticed that one rider at the back of the group had quietly dismounted and was moving through the shadows toward the house. The real danger was just beginning. The man moving through the shadows was Buck Henley, a known troublemaker from Austin who'd been hired for the specific purpose of solving the Morrison problem, while Sarah continued to address the mounted group, trying to diffuse the tension with her words. Buck positioned himself behind the ranch house with a clear shot at both Jake and Sarah. "You speak well, woman," Mayor Hartwell called out, his voice somewhat less hostile than before. "But pretty words don't change the facts. What you and Morrison have done goes against the natural order, against God himself." "Does it?" Sarah asked calmly. "I've read the Bible, Mayor Hartwell. I've read it cover to cover multiple times, and nowhere in it does it say that God's love is limited by the color of someone's skin." Some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. These were, for the most part, God-fearing men who attended church regularly. Sarah's calm recitation of Christian principles was having an effect that threats and violence could not. Jake, meanwhile, had noticed the missing rider and was scanning the shadows around the house. His instincts, honed by years on the frontier, told him they were in more danger than was immediately apparent. "Sarah," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the darkness beyond the torchlight, "we need to move inside." But Sarah was making progress with the crowd. Several of the men were nodding at her words, and she could see doubt creeping into their faces. "I know some of you," she continued. "Mr. Pierce, I delivered your grandson when Dr. Henderson was too drunk to stand. Mrs. Pemberton, I sat with you all night when you had the fever last spring. Mer. Crawford, I set your son's broken arm when he fell from the barn roof." Each man she named looked increasingly uncomfortable. These weren't strangers she was addressing. These were people whose lives she had touched, whose families she had helped. "I never asked for payment beyond what you could afford. I never refused to help because of your politics or your opinions about me. I helped because that's what healers do." Sarah's voice grew stronger. All Jake and I want is to continue that work together as husband and wife. That's when Buck Henley made his move. He stepped out of the shadows, rifle raised, aimed directly at Sarah's back. Enough talk. He shouted, "Time to end this abomination." Everything happened at once. Jake saw the gunman and lunged toward Sarah. Shouting a warning, several of the mounted men turned in surprise, some reaching for their own weapons. Sarah spun around just as Buck's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out across the ranch yard, echoing off the buildings and sending horses into nervous prancing. But the bullet didn't find its intended target. Jim Crawford, the hardware store owner who had been one of the witnesses at their wedding, had seen Buck moving into position, drawing his own pistol. He'd fired first, his bullet catching Buck in the shoulder and spinning him around just as he fired. Buck's shot went wide, embedding itself in the wooden wall of the house. In the chaos that followed, Jake reached Sarah and pulled her behind the cover of a water trough. The mounted men were shouting at each other, some trying to control their frightened horses, others demanding to know who Buck Henley was and who had hired him. Nobody hired that man, Mayor Hartwell shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. This was supposed to be a peaceful conversation. Buck Henley, wounded but not fatally, was trying to reload his rifle when Tom Bradley, Jake's former foreman, appeared seemingly from nowhere and knocked the weapon from his hands. "That's enough," Tom shouted. "This has gone too far." The confrontation might have escalated into a full-gun battle. But at that moment, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. "What in God's name is happening here?" Everyone turned to see Reverend Matthews riding up the road, accompanied by Dr. Elizabeth Crawford and several other townspeople, including some of the wives of the men in the confrontation. "Reverend," Mayor Hartwell called out, his voice defensive, "we were just trying to reason with Morrison about his situation by bringing armed men to his ranch at night." Reverend Matthews' voice was sharp with disapproval. "By threatening a man and woman who were legally married in the sight of God." Dr. Crawford dismounted and went immediately to check on Buck Henley's wound, her medical training overriding any other considerations. As she worked, she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I've been practicing medicine for 15 years, and I can tell you that Sarah Morrison, yes, Morrison, knows more about healing than most trained doctors I've met. This community would be fortunate to have her skills available in a proper medical facility." Mrs. Pierce, the farmer's wife, spoke up from her position beside the Reverend. "Sarah delivered my grandson safely when Dr. Henderson said both baby and mother would die. How can we stand here and threaten someone who saved my family?" One by one, other voices joined in. People Sarah had helped, families she had served, began to speak up. The mob that had come to threaten and intimidate found itself facing a counter-narrative of healing and service. Mayor Hartwell looked around at the changing mood of the crowd and made a decision. "Buck Henley, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. The rest of you men, this gathering is over. Go home." As the crowd began to disperse, some of the men approached Jake and Sarah with expressions of embarrassment and apology. Not all of them, some, left still angry and unreconciled, but enough to give hope that change was possible. Jake and Sarah stood together in their ranch yard, holding each other as the last of the torches disappeared into the night. They had survived their first test as a married couple, but both knew it wouldn't be their last. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Jake looked around at his empty ranch, thinking of the contracts he'd lost, the men who'd abandoned him, the uncertain future they faced. "Now we rebuild," he said simply, "together." But neither of them could have imagined how that rebuilding would transform not just their lives, but their entire community. 6 months later, in April of 1874, the Morrison Medical Clinic opened its doors in a newly constructed building on Main Street in Willow Creek. The funding had come from an unexpected source, not just Jake's cattle money, but from donations gathered by Reverend Matthews and a group of church women who had been moved by Sarah's compassion and skill. The clinic was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more: clean white walls, proper medical equipment shipped from Austin and Houston, separate rooms for different types of treatment, and a small pharmacy stocked with the latest medicines. Most importantly, it bore a sign that read, "Morrison Medical Clinic, Sarah Morrison, practitioner, all patients welcome." Jake stood in the doorway on opening day, watching his wife examine her first official patient, old Pete Henderson, ironically enough, who had come in complaining of stomach pains that turned out to be caused more by whiskey than any medical condition. "Mrs. Morrison," Pete said as Sarah finished her examination, I owe you an apology. I've been drinking myself into the grave while this town needed real medical care. You got more skill in your little finger than I ever had." Sarah smiled as she handed him a bottle of medicine and a list of dietary changes. "Dr. Henderson, we all have different paths to our calling. The important thing is that we're both here now to serve the community." The transformation hadn't been easy or complete. Jake had lost most of his cattle business and had to sell off large portions of his ranch to fund the clinic and their new life. Some people in town still refused to accept Sarah as a legitimate medical practitioner, and a few families had left Willow Creek entirely rather than live in a community with an interracial couple. But others had surprised them. Tom Bradley had returned to work at the much smaller Morrison Ranch, bringing the other cowboys with him. "A man's got to stand for something," he told Jake, "and I decided I'd rather stand with you than against you." Mayor Hartwell had never fully accepted the marriage, but he'd come to respect Sarah's medical abilities after she successfully treated his wife's difficult pregnancy. Banker Pemberton had even extended credit to help establish the clinic, partly from guilt over the night of the confrontation. The real change, however, came from the patients themselves. Word of Sarah's skill spread beyond Willow Creek to neighboring communities. People began traveling from 50 miles away to seek treatment from the miracle healer, who could cure ailments that other doctors couldn't even diagnose. "Jake," Sarah said as they closed the clinic that evening after a busy first day, "do you ever regret it, giving up so much for this?" Jake looked around the clinic, then at his wife's face glowing with satisfaction and purpose. "Sarah, I spent 15 years building a cattle empire that made me rich but never made me happy. In 6 months of marriage to you, building this clinic, fighting for our future, I've been happier than in all those previous years combined." Sarah moved into his arms, and they stood together in their clinic, surrounded by the tools of healing and hope. "There's something else," Sarah said softly, "something I wanted to tell you on our clinic's opening day." "What's that?" Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "We're going to have a baby, Jake. Our child will grow up in a world where love really can overcome hatred, where dreams really can come true." Jake felt his knees go weak with emotion. A baby, their baby, a child who would be living proof that love knew no color, no boundaries, no limitations except those that people chose to impose. As they walked home to their small house behind the clinic, Jake had sold the big ranch house to help fund their new life. They passed people on the street who nodded respectfully, some even tipping their hats to Sarah. Not everyone, but enough to show that change was possible. "What should we name the baby?" Jake asked as they sat on their porch, watching the stars come out over Willow Creek. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "after the man who loved me before you, after the dream that didn't come true. So he can represent the dream that did." Jake nodded, understanding. "And if it's a girl, Hope," Sarah said without hesitation, "because that's what we've given each other, what we've given this community, what we'll give our children, hope that the world can be better than it is." As they sat together under the Texas stars, Jake Morrison and Sarah Morrison, the rich rancher and the healer who had dared to love across the color line, knew that their story was just beginning. They had faced down hatred with love, overcome prejudice with compassion, and built something beautiful from the ashes of old fears and limitations. Their clinic would serve the community for decades to come. Their children would grow up in a world slowly learning that love truly was stronger than hate, and their marriage would stand as proof that sometimes when the hearts find each other, they really can change the world. The promise Jake had made to Sarah in her small cabin, that he would help her build her dreams, had come true. But the greater promise, the one they had made to each other and to the future, was that love, real love, always finds a way. In Willow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, it had found a way, and it always would.